Hi, I'm Bill Crystal. Welcome back to Conversations. I'm very pleased to be joined for the second time by Jonathan Karl, ABC News chief Washington correspondent. We had an earlier conversation right at the beginning of 2022, focusing on John's previous book on Donald Trump, Betrayal, the final act of the Trump show. Really an excellent account of January 6th and its implications. And I think that was a very helpful conversation for people. And so I'm very glad that John has joined me again to now talk about what's happened since that book and where we now stand with Donald Trump, the author of a new book, Tired of Winning Donald Trump and the End of the Grand Old Party. John, did you encountered Trump, I think, a little bit when you were a New York Post reporter in the 90s. And did you expect to end up writing not even two, but three books, right? Because the first one was the Trump show, front row at the Trump show while he was still in the White House. 3 books on Donald Trump. Is this was this your dream when you were a cub reporter,
As I was a young reporter in my 20s for the New York Post, I had a great source named Donald Trump, but it was never about anything remotely to do with politics. And I certainly... I mean, if you had asked me, what do you think? You'll be a White House reporter. You'll be the president of the White House Correspondent Association, and that dude you're with at Trump Tower is going to be the president. Fantasy land.
Yeah, but unfortunately, if I might editorialize, not, right? All too true, all too real. The one reason I so respect John's reporting is that he does real reporting, granular reporting, but also sees the forest as well as the trees, which isn't always the case, I would say. And also, I think you've been willing to be surprised by events and not sort of stick to your first impression of something if it turns out that he's changed or we've changed or the country's changed. And so you've really been an excellent chronicler of the Trump years. And I think now very important, this new book, a very important chronicler of the current moment as we speak in, the end of November 27th, 2023. So, John, thanks for joining me again.
Great, Bill. Thanks for having me.
And let's just dive right in. I mean, where do we stand with Donald Trump? I mean, he's the front-running candidate, obviously, for the Republican nomination in 2024. When we were talking about this before the show, I had said, how should we begin? There's so much to talk about. We could talk about how your views of how he's changed, how, in a way, your views might have changed a little bit over the 7-8 years since 2015. And you said, why don't we just jump in with where he is now and what he's saying now and what he might do as president. So begin with that.
Well, first of all, I think that there's the question of where he is politically right now. And there's almost this perception, this conventional wisdom that he is the inevitable Republican nominee, that he's almost like the incumbent president. And there's just, there's no way that any of these that are challenging him will get any traction. The polls seem to bear that out. I think, and we can get to this later, Bill, but I believe that the Republican primary actually isn't over yet. In fact, I might point out that nobody's actually voted yet, but that the same people who were saying that he is inevitably going to be the Republican nominee were many of the same people that would say he had no chance of winning in 2016. It's just a mirror image of this sense of inevitability. I think he is a far more volatile figure than he was even in 2016 or as president. I think that there's been very little attention paid. It's one of the main reasons I wrote this book as to where, what has happened to him since he left the White House, who the people are around him, what potentially a second Trump term could look like. I think there's been very little discussion of this. It's hard to make the case that Trump is undercovered, but in this case, I think he is undercovered.
No, that's such an important point. I mean, I very much agree with that. He's overcovered in some ways, the ridiculousness, the buffoonishness, the mini outrages of the hour or the day, but not as potentially the next president of the United States. So yeah, begin with that. I think that's really so important. I mean, what do we now know about, let's bracket the question of whether he is the nominee. I think he's likely to be, but certainly, as you say, very volatile times, and so nothing is inevitable. But what would Trump 2.0 look like based on what he's saying and the people around him? And then we can maybe go backwards also a little bit, how different it is in a way from 2015. But
the first time around, it was something as unconventional as the campaign. There were some rather conventional messages. He cast himself as the business mastermind that was going to hire all the best negotiators and the best people and get the best deals for America because we had been sold down the river, and that he was the guy that could make it happen. He had very few campaign specifics, but they were understandable. He was going to be tougher on immigration. He was going to build the wall. He was going to have China pay for it. He was going to be tough on trade. There were a few broad brushstrokes, kind of a conventional isolationist, protectionist version of the Republican Party. Actually hearkening back to America First, which was a phrase he trotted out in 2016, even though I don't think he necessarily understood the historic significance of that phrase. Now the campaign is based on grievance and revenge. I think that the signature phrase of this campaign was one he trotted out earlier this year. I am your retribution. In 2016, I said, I am your voice. Now I say, I am your retribution. And by your retribution, he means his retribution. He wants to go out and get revenge and make those who have gone after him pay for it. That includes certainly the prosecutors, the justice system, but it also includes all of those Republicans who tried to push him out yet again after January 6th.
That's so interesting. I hadn't really thought about that formula. That Trump himself, in a way, understands that it's different, right? In 2016, it was, I am your voice. I mean, did he himself, I guess, says, in 2016, I said, I am your voice. Now I'm saying,
he quotes himself, and now he says, I'm doing something else.
Yeah. In 2016, it was, I alone can fix it, which is a little demagogic and slightly, you might say, dictatorial feeling,
Yeah.
But it's not that different from a president just saying, I'm the guy who can take care of this, right? And now it's really different, partly because of the people around him and partly because of his experiences as president. What's key to the difference?
I think, first of all, that this campaign, in a very real sense, is a campaign for his own survival. This is no longer just a campaign to become president of the United States. In some ways, I think he sees it as a campaign to stay out of jail. So there's that. But also, the people around him it's entirely different. And I spent a fair amount of time in the book, going through, the people who served him at very senior roles. I interviewed some of them who were candidly for the first time. Some of them did it previously. Some are doing it now for the first time. Talking about him in eviscerating terms. I mean, just that he is a danger to the republic, wouldn't be able to accomplish any of the goals he sets out. And I mean, these are people that he put in very high positions in his own administration: Secretary of Defense, Chief of Staff, White House counsel's office, who have been very clear about what they think of Trump and what he think he would be in a second term. So a lot of those people in the Trump White House and the Trump cabinet served as a restraining influence on him. Not always very effectively. He wasn't an easy guy to restrain, but they undermined him in many different ways. Some publicly, some directly, some, kind of behind the scenes and trying to make sure he didn't notice. But those people are gone now. I mean, the people around him, and it's a very, very small circle now. This is even smaller than the campaign in 2016. Certainly smaller than what he had in his White House. The people around him are there to follow orders. I mean, they are there to be, first and foremost, unquestionably loyal to Donald Trump because he wants anybody who is not out and gone.
I mean, the loyalty, but also loyalty to a certain vision of what he would do as president, I suppose, in a second term, which would be to do all the things that he was sort of had the instinct he might want to do, but was stopped from doing in the first term. I guess I'm struck that he does seem to have loyalty plus ideology now. And ideology is quite the right word, but, a certain kind of real proto-dictatorial impulse that wasn't quite there in nearly as extreme a form, I don't think, in going into the first term. Or even during much of the first term.
I mean, it is a dictatorial impulse at the very least, and some of his some of his people who are influential at this point. Steve Bannon, I think, is newly back in a way, maybe in a much more important role than he was even when he was brought into the White House as chief strategist. He was brought in as part of a three-headed monster of, Reince Priebus. So you had like a little bit of the quasi-Republican establishment, and then you had Jared, his son-in-law, who was, kind of more maybe liberal Democrat in his impulses, but all about the family. And Bannon had to struggle for influence in that. I mean, now I think Bannon's ideas, which is very much this idea of retribution, and rooting out the so-called deep state, basically just destroying what is there in our federal government and rebuilding anew. This is a Bannon idea, and there's no longer conflicting influences. That is the purpose of this campaign.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I hadn't really thought of it that way. I mean, Bannon was, as you say, maybe 1/3 of the influence on Trump in 2017, and now he's, in terms of the conception of the Trump presidency, I think the dominant one. Would you say? Probably.
I think he's absolutely dominant, and it is interesting that Jared Kushner and Ivanka have both kind of sworn off this, this campaign. I think it was often overstated. Whenever Trump did something really outrageous, there would be stories. Well, Ivanka really tried to move her father in the right direction. I think that was overstated often, but there was something to it. There was something to that, and they're gone. But so are, he's not going to bring in a guy like John Kelly again, or Jim Mattis, Don McGahn, his first White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, his final White House counsel, Bill Barr, Jeff Sessions, all of whom, were to varying degrees loyal to the Trump agenda, such as it is, but also felt it needed to be within the confines of the law and the Constitution. Those people are now not only no longer around Trump, they are pariahs in Trump land. And the goal is to bring in a team that will not repeat what those people did, which was basically try to make sure Trump didn't break the law or violate the Constitution.
And I suppose it's not an accident that, I think you say this in the book, that one of the red lines now for it's personal loyalty to Trump, but also not being anti-January 6th, if that's the right way to put it, right?
Yes. Certainly the obsession over the election, which is Trump has not wavered from that from a moment since November of 2020. You need to be a true believer, or at least sound like a true believer, that the election was stolen. But it's how you perceive January 6th, which Trump has, when I interviewed him at Mar-a-Lago just about 6 or 7 weeks after he left the White House. And he was already at that point describing January 6th as one of the greatest days ever. I mean, he said it was the biggest crowd he had ever spoken before. It was a wonderful day. It got marred a little later on, but it was a wonderful day. And he told me in that interview, this is interesting, Bill, because in preparing this book, I went over everything. I went, when I wrote Betrayal, it was the immediate aftermath of January 6th, and I was getting on the record. I felt it was my duty to get the historic record, talk to the people closest to Trump about what went down, what led to that day. And I had 2 interviews with Trump that were rather illuminating. One of them is, as you may remember, he was justifying the people who were chanting for Mike Pence's execution, hang Mike Pence. He was telling me, well, they were angry. I mean, how can you pass on a fraudulent vote? So I, in preparing for this book, went back and looked at all of that again, and I found some stuff that, frankly, I hadn't really seen as significant, but now I see in a whole new light. In that interview I did in March of 2021, he tells me that he did want to go to the Capitol after his speech on the January 6th. I didn't believe it, so I kind of bracketed it, ignored it. Then I heard, obviously, Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony and the testimony of several others about how he fought with the Secret Service and really wanted to go up. But he said something else in the very next sentence, which I also didn't see the significance of at the time. He said, and I wanted to go back later during the problem. And let me tell you this, if I had gone, I would have been very well received. I would have been very well received, I can tell you that. So he's saying that he would have been very well received during the problem, during the assault on the Capitol, which is just sick in and of itself, but it's also a significant concession and admission that he had total influence over those people. He could have called them off.
And they were his people. And
they were his people.
And he ends up now not
FBI
just sort
informants.
Of, what's that?
They weren't FBI informants.
Yeah. No, that they kind of abandoned that argument. They were Antifa, whatever. But I mean, yeah, they went from what they did wasn't so bad. You've got to be, understanding of their motives to huge, simply defending them and defending the whole effort on January 6th. That's what's, I think, in your first book, you sort of, this is the second book, I guess, the book Betrayal. You saw that coming, as it were. I mean, you saw the beginning of that move by Trump, but to have thought that it would accelerate or intensify over the subsequent 2 years since you wrote the book, and that he'd be the front runner for the nomination, which means that presumably the Republican Party, one of our two major parties, is basically going to run as a pro-January 6th party in 2024. That's pretty stunning, right?
It certainly is. And I think that there's been not enough attention on this because it's interesting. If you look at what Trump has done since he has announced he is running for president, the one thing that he has done very little of is actual campaigning. So there's not much to cover. He does a rally every once in a while. He'll say a few outrageous things. They'll be noted or they'll be ignored. But, he has spent most of his time at Mar-a-Lago or his other properties up in Bedminster around a very small group of political aides and his lawyers, because so much attention is focused on his legal cases. So I really tried to do reporting on what he is up to, because we're not seeing as much of him or hearing as much about him. And I think this is some of the most illuminating stuff in the book. He is in a very dark place. He has very little outside influence of a mainstream variety. He's surrounded by enablers, and he is plotting a comeback for the purposes of destroying his enemies as he perceives them. And when he's not doing that, he's doing things like, some of the stuff kind of, we see a lot of was public, but selling his NFTs, dining with Kanye West or Nick Fuentes, hosting a fundraiser for a prominent QAnon figure. He is not, he's not surrounded by, the kind of people that he brought into his administration in 2017.
I guess maybe one way to say it is it's not just that the guardrails are weaker than they were, but that he wants to just ride roughshod over them. Is that unfair? I was very struck in the book you did, Johnny McEntee. Tell us, as a guy who's both very close to Trump now and would be very important in a Trump second term and was important, I guess, at the end of the Trump first term. But say a word about him, because he's not someone people have heard of.
Massively important and really important understanding what Trump 2.0 would look like. Johnny McEntee, who interestingly was the first guy I met on the Trump campaign in 2015, because he was about one of the first 10 employees. So, outside of Hope Hicks, who, was his kind of chief advisor on everything way back then, McEntee was a guy who was in his 20s. He was a quarterback at UConn, graduated, went to work for Fox as a very junior job in the newsroom, and then quit Fox to go volunteer at the Trump campaign. It's right after Trump announced. So he came into the White House basically as Trump's body guy. which means you carry the president's bags. You often see him carrying those boxes, by the way. If you look at old footage of Trump going to and back and forth from Marine One, many of those boxes that would become famous were carried in and out of the helicopter by John McEntee. He had his desk right outside the Oval Office in a little area called the Outer Oval. And he was eventually fired by John Kelly. Issues came up on his background check. Once Kelly was fired, he was brought back in. And this was 2020, like just as, I think his first day on the job was literally Valentine's Day of 2020. So just as COVID is starting to hit, but before, so much is shut down, McEntee is brought in as the head of presidential personnel. And which is amazing because he had never hired anybody in his life or fired anybody. And now he was in charge of effectively the most important HR department in the federal government.
And that's a job that in the past has been typically held by sort of senior-ish aides who are, know how to balance all the constituencies, but also hire competent people for some of these important political appointments. Not a 30-year-old or whatever who
4,000 political appointments from cabinet secretaries on down all go through the presidential personnel office. So Johnny goes in there, sweeps out everybody who was there before, and brings in a bunch of his buddies, like some of his college buddies, some, Instagram influencers, young women that he liked. And it's literally almost entirely people in their 20s. Some of them had not graduated from college yet. And they begin by saying that they want to go through and do basically loyalty tests throughout the Trump administration to root out the rhinos, to root out those that aren't truly loyal to the president. And they start scheduling these interviews with, there were a couple of cases it was cabinet secretaries, but certainly deputy secretaries and these top positions throughout the federal government. So that's Johnny McEntee, and he orchestrates at the end the decapitation of the entire leadership at the Pentagon after the election. Esper's fired, 3 other top political appointees in the Defense Department are fired. Kash Patel and other people seemed as truly loyal to Trump were put in, raising alarm bells. Pompeo's calling up Bill Barr, I found out, saying we got to be worried about what's happening over at the Pentagon. I don't know where this is going. That's Johnny McEntee. Now he's working on Project 2025, which is designed to create the policies and the personnel for the next Republican administration. And their whole approach is not just the 4,000 political appointees, but they want to go through and fire the civil servants and ensure that loyalists are in government from the top to the bottom. And again, it might literally be Johnny McEntee again. If it's not Johnny McEntee, it'll be somebody like him. But it reminds me, it's a little bit like the Red Guards in Maoist China. We want to go through and get rid of the intellectual class. Anybody who's not fully on board with the man, we want out. And there was a story, Bill, I don't know if you saw it, but the Axios broke a story just recently about how as they come up with their personnel lists, they're using AI so they can really screen through everything in somebody's background to see if there's any hint of possible disloyalty. One of the people who worked with McEntee said, look, the point is loyalty is more important than policy because you can teach policy, but you can't teach loyalty. So that's the first and foremost criteria for another Trump administration is who will carry out the orders.
Yeah, the Red Guards thing is it may seem like an extreme example, but it's actually a suggestive one in the sense that the Red Guards and Communist China, they couldn't have done what they had done unless the Communist Party, which was a massive organization, basically felt it had to go along or chose to go along because Mao wanted them to go along. And I do feel like, and you mentioned this point in the book, if there weren't a big conservative establishment out there that was saying to McEntee, okay, happy to be part of that project, and we're at the Heritage Foundation or at other places, and sign us up, and we'll help provide some of the work. And actually, probably some of those people are a little more experienced and can sort of actually, do that work kind of competently in terms of how do we change the civil service rules for, to let us fire so many more people and so forth. So it's a weird combination of sort of impulsive, flaky, unqualified people, frankly, but with enough behind them that they could actually, I think, not be ineffectual in trying to do the pretty astonishing things they want to do. I mean, do you agree with that? It just feels like he's sort of stumbled into this combination that's very dangerous, which is sort of pure loyalty, as you say, but sort of backed up by people whose ideology has, in the last 7 or 8 years, been so radicalized that they're happy to be part of this enterprise.
I mean, he was in some ways comically inept in the White House. There were, they came in, especially in those first few days. Remember, like the ill thought through travel ban that seemed like it was crafted on the back of a napkin that created chaos in airports all around the world, and but was quickly thrown out because it just couldn't pass muster. To the very end, where it was McEntee, I describe in the book, who had issued this executive order, executive order calling for the immediate withdrawal, actually by January 15th, 2021, of all U.S. troops in Afghanistan, the withdrawal of all troops out of Iraq and Syria, the withdrawal of all American troops out of Germany, and then they added a fourth provision of U.S. troops out of Somalia. This was all done and I go through in detail how McEntee literally got on Google to see, how a executive order could be drafted. He had Colonel Douglas McGregor, best known for various Fox appearances during the non-primetime hours, for the most part, telling him to go to the cabinet and get out an old executive order and follow the template. And he got Trump to sign it, sent it to the Pentagon, but it didn't go through the staff secretary. It didn't go through legal review. It didn't go through, and the whole thing ended up going nowhere, causing a little bit of chaos, but going nowhere. So they were incompetent. But I do think that he's been through that now. And there'll still be a lot of incompetence, I have no doubt. But there will also be a sense of, they've got a little bit more of a sense of how to do this stuff, and they have fewer people around who are trying to stop it. In that case, you had Mark Milley, and you had Robert O'Brien, you had Pat Cipollone, you had some people who, when they got word of this massive movement of U.S. forces just being ordered in this thing just signed by the president, they had to go to Trump and say, "Look, sir, this is not going to work." But those people won't be around. Will there still be a lot of incompetence? No doubt. But they may actually do some of this stuff this time around.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. It's not both; those people won't be around. That's, I think, a very important point. The Cipollones and national security advisors who were at least somewhat, constrained and wanted to constrain Trump a little bit and so forth. But the other thing is, as you say, they'll be replaced by people who, some of whom are incompetent, I suppose, but some of whom will be true believers, but they'll know how to write. They will be able to fulfill the job of staff secretary or White House counsel, and know how to do some of these things. They may not do them quite as elegantly as a really great White House counsel from the old days would have done, but the notion that I do feel like the apparatchiks will be there helping the McEntees of the world make those things and helping Trump make those things happen. And Trump's not going to accept quite. What do you think? I mean, you've been following so closely. People telling him, "Well, sir, you can't do that." I mean, that was sort of worked in the first term. I don't see how that works in the second term.
Well, I think that we'll have constitutional crisis from day one if he comes back. I mean, let me give you just one example. It took Trump until I think it was June of 2017 to get his cabinet fully confirmed, but he did. They all went through Senate confirmation. And then as various cabinet secretaries left, there were a few that went through confirmation again, but it was an administration of acting secretaries for the most part. And I remember Trump famously saying, "I like acting. It's kind of nice. You appoint your person, you don't have to deal with the Senate, and then you can fire them whenever you want. It's really easy. And, it's fantastic." But they did work through the Vacancies Act, which has certain restrictions. You can't put anybody in charge. You've got to get people that had held equivalent level in the federal government, that had gone through previous Senate confirmation, et cetera. So it was a smaller group that he could choose from for his, Rick Grinnell becomes the head of national intelligence on an acting basis because he was the ambassador to Germany. I mean, they stretched the limits of the Vacancies Act, but they operated for the most part within its bounds. Are they going to do that next time around? I mean, is Trump going to wait around for Congress, for the Senate to confirm an attorney general? Or is he going to put somebody over there and say, okay, now what? And then who's going to enforce that? They're going to go to the courts and challenge it, and then who's going to enforce? I mean, I think they've truly, the impulse here is truly lawless.
Yeah, well, that's chilling, but I very much agree with that. And I don't think people have come to grips with that. They still sort of assume, hey, this is America. There's the rule of law. Obviously, you can stretch things, you can go into the gray areas, as presidents do sometimes with executive orders that are, based on ambiguous laws. The courts strike it down sometimes, but when the courts strike it down, you do obey it. You complain a little bit, but then you don't. You change your student loan forgiveness program or whatever Biden did, and Trump himself too, even with the
travel ban got modified.
Travel ban, yeah. I agree. He won't have people necessarily in the Justice Department or the White House counsel's office telling him, "Sir, we really have to obey this." Rather, they'll be telling him what Eastman told him, right, in sort of January 6th context. I mean, isn't that's exactly the model for the second term? No,
it's the model for the second term when you have people saying that the vice president can unilaterally toss out electoral votes. I mean, I think you can come up with a rationale for doing just about anything.
I was struck that, it was reported that he personally, or at least the people around him, don't like the Federalist Society anymore. I guess he personally...
No. He told me that on the record.
Okay.
He told me that on the record. He is outraged at the Federalist Society because they steered him the wrong way. Because he put these 3 justices on the Supreme Court, and they did nothing to stop Joe Biden from stealing the election. I mean, he thought that those were his justices. Yeah. So when they ruled to not even take up, some of these absurd electoral challenges, like the Texas case, the Texas Attorney General case, Trump was outraged, absolutely outraged.
Yeah, I mean, I think. Yeah, it's the Federal Society. They were very ideological, and a lot of people don't agree with a lot of things Federal Society appointees did or said, and in the government or as judges, obviously. But it's still a different world from some of what we saw in those last few months. Some of those judges who were appointed right near the end, and again, the kinds of people who were willing to go to who wanted to do what Trump wanted to do with justice. I think that's so revealing that the internal Department of Justice fight, where you have the Federal Society people who are very conservative, unitary executive, all that stuff, but saying, no, that's too much. But what's his name?
Jeffrey Clark. Jeffrey Clark.
I was Clark and confused. That's bad. Yeah. Jeffrey Clark says, "Yep, I'm there." And I remember at the time when that all came out, when you reported it, and then when the January 6th committee read it, everyone thought, "Well, he's finished." Jeffrey Clark. Jeffrey Clark is, if I'm not mistaken, sort of reasonably close to Trump and to Trump world. And,
yes.
And he might not be able to make him attorney general, because he couldn't be confirmed, though, as you say. Does that matter anymore? But he's not going to be in the White House, formally or informally, telling Trump what he can and should do.
Yeah. And I think that whole episode, first of all, it was so, I don't know if we've really can just establish the absurdity of it. This all happened in the beginning of January, when he was trying to engineer the coup at the Justice Department. I mean, he has 2 weeks, less than 3 weeks left on his presidency. And he's trying to oust the acting Attorney General, Jeffrey Rosen, who is refusing to do as he orders, and to install the one guy that he can find in the Justice Department who would do it. And so just the absurdity of, even at that moment, he's lost all the legal challenges. It's become clear he's not going to have the votes to toss out electoral votes on January 6th. That his vice president's not going to go along with the crazy demand that he unilaterally do it. So he tries to, engineer this change at the Justice Department, and every single political appointee at that upper level associate attorney general level says that they will resign if Trump makes this guy Jeffrey Clark the acting attorney general. Again, this gets to the point. There were good people, maybe very conservative people that many don't agree with or whatever, but believed in the rule of law. And they stopped a crisis that could have been much greater. None of those people. The goal of a second Trump term from the start would be to ensure that no people like that are back in those positions of authority.
I think you've discussed at times the pardon power and how Trump was frustrated that he did pardon a lot of people, incidentally, and people got away with things, therefore, which set up precedent for what could happen in the future. But it seems like he really came to understand how powerful that power could be late in his presidency. And I think now don't you think he really understands what government could look like if all the political appointees, if they go too far and break the law in doing what Trump wants, are going to be pardoned by him? I mean, that's...
He was kind of selfish with the pardon power at the end. I mean, he had people like Matt Gaetz and others who were coming in looking for kind of preemptive pardons, and he didn't help them out. He did pardon Bannon on the last day in office. I think it was the second to last pardon before Jeanine Pirro's husband. But the point is, he understood the power of pardoning, and you can, if somebody breaks the law on his behalf as a federal official, that's pretty easy to deal with. Just pardon.
And I don't know that
to get out of jail free card.
He wouldn't wait till the last month either. He would do it in real time.
You can do it right then. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's what's really I think people haven't really, he did some of that. Obviously, he used it to help Manafort, I think, avoid, fully testifying and so forth. But Roger Stone. But I think the degree to which, again, that becomes something, if you combine it with everything else, that as you say, get out of jail free card sitting right there. Yeah. When the counsel in your department tells you, and I was, this happened. This is illegal. Sir, you probably really shouldn't do. And I'm not saying Trump, just tells the cabinet secretary. That's a risky thing to do. That's okay. I'm going to go tell the president, or tell the president's not chief of staff, who will not be like John Kelly or Reince Priebus, and he'll say, fine, go ahead and do it. And then I'll just get pardoned. I mean, foreign policy too. You discuss your conversation with Tucker Carlson. Again, he was checked on a lot of things he sort of had the instinct of doing. You mentioned already the late January memo that McEntee wrote, or executive order he wrote, but then earlier on, getting out of NATO and all kinds of things. It feels to me like, again, the things, his most radical instincts in that area too could be just followed through on by the kinds of people he's likely to have around him. Yeah, I mean, he had his instincts were to. I mean, he had nothing but contempt for NATO. I remember the interview he did with the Washington Post editorial board in the 2016 campaign. Seemed to not even necessarily have a good grasp on Article 5 and what all that meant. But as he came to understand it, his main objective, as far as NATO was concerned, was to get more out of our allies, which, by the way, is, the idea of having our allies shoulder more of their self-defense is something that's been a priority of presidents in both parties and all that. But Trump was actively and continually bringing up the idea of bringing our troops home from South Korea, bringing our troops home from Germany. And the Tucker Carlson conversation, I had learned that Trump was having, at first I was told it was near daily conversations with Trump. So I called Tucker. I mean, you and I both, and he worked for you at one point. So, I back in those days, I mean, I've known him maybe even longer than you have. We've both known him for a long, long, long time. And I called him up just to see if this was true. And he acknowledged, we do talk regularly. He said it wasn't really every day. It was more like maybe once or twice a week. And I said, the person that told me this thought he was kind of lonely. That's why he was talking to you. And he said, well, I don't know if it was really that. It was because it was most of these conversations, according to Tucker Carlson, were about foreign policy and specifically about Ukraine. He said the calls became much more regular after the invasion of Ukraine.
And he said, Trump agrees with me far more than he lets on in public. He's far more radical on this than he lets on in public. As a matter of fact, he's basically the only person, classic kind of Tucker Carlson exaggeration perhaps, but not necessarily substantively wrong here, that nobody is more in sync with where he is on Russia and Ukraine than Donald Trump. And Tucker Carlson's position on Ukraine, which is basically that Ukraine's the aggressor, he basically echoes what you see on Russian state television, and that's where Trump is, according to Tucker Carlson.
So we wouldn't have just a constitutional crisis at home, but we'd have a pretty big foreign policy crisis the moment he takes office, or really the moment he's elected, I'd say, because it's not like foreign governments won't see what's coming. And
because he would end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours.
Yeah.
And we can imagine how he might do that, which is basically just to side with Russia.
And the implications for other countries' judgments in that point about whether they can count on the U.S. and whether they have to take care of themselves, or what deals they have to cut with Russia, or for that matter, China and other countries. I mean, I think it's people, again, I think haven't fully. We dodged a lot of bullets in the first term is the way I think of it, and people therefore haven't kind of come to grips with what a second term might look like in foreign policy, as well as in what you've been discussing so well on domestic policy. It's pretty, yeah. And the Republican Party, would that stop him, do you think, in the second term?
I mean,
I suppose Democrats might control one or both houses of Congress, so they might try to stop him to some degree, but you do need at some point to have both party. I mean, there was let me put it this way. In the first two books, there's some Republican pushback behind the scenes, right, that slows down some of the things he's trying to do, though most of the story is the conquest of the Republican Party by Trump. But did you find in writing this book, or in your just current reporting, any sense that, okay, we might have to push back again during the campaign or during a Trump presidency, if there is one?
I mean, there still is that pushback. You still hear the same things when, people are just talking to you and they're not publicly taking issue with him. But I mean, it's very much become his party. And it's on autopilot. You look at the mess in the House over the speakership. He was not a factor in either the, 15 rounds it took for McCarthy to get elected in the first place, or in McCarthy's ouster. But it was all, Trump acolytes that were causing the crisis and the impasse. They weren't acting on Trump's orders because Trump, first wasn't paying much attention. And then once he was, they didn't care what he had to say, actually. They were just, moving in their own direction. But I don't see, I mean, look at the people who won't be there. Mitt Romney, is gone. Cassidy, will be gone. Those who voted to impeach him, those who voted to convict him, will almost all entirely be gone. A few of them will be left. There's still 2 House members left who voted to impeach him. But they're the people that really were willing publicly to stand up for Trump are not really there anymore.
Yeah, I thought Trump's lack of involvement in the speaker race in a funny way showed how powerful he is, because he doesn't need to be involved.
He doesn't need to be
involved. And indeed, who became Speaker of the House? The most radical, ideological, MAGA, true believer person you could have had. He's not going to object to much that Trump does, I don't think, Mike Johnson.
Which is why Trumpism lasts beyond Trump. I mean, this is a party. There's still a struggle for the control of the party, but it's not much of one anymore. I
mean, if Mike Johnson is Speaker when Trump is president and Mitch McConnell, I'm not sure he'd still be leader. I don't know that he could survive politically a Trump victory, and there'd be such a mood of, okay, the old guard needs to go. And so again, think Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, what everyone thinks of them, 2017-18, when Republicans controlled both branches, it's kind of different from what it would be with Mike Johnson and whoever would succeed McConnell in the context of a Trump reelection. I think people, again, as we've stressed throughout this conversation, underrate
I mean, whatever you want to say about Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, Ryan already out of power by the time the January 6th happens. But both of them were crystal clear about the integrity of the election. And both of them were crystal clear in saying that Congress had no constitutional right to overthrow duly certified electoral votes from any state. And both of them were absolutely crystal clear in condemning what happened on January 6th and laying the blame at Donald Trump. And Ryan is long gone, obviously, but I agree with you. If McConnell is around, I don't, obviously he's got his own issues, health issues and everything else, but that's not going to be Mitch McConnell's a Republican minority or majority. And in that case, it probably will be a Republican majority.
Yeah, the other person who was very clear was Mike Pence, and it's not going to be a vice president. I don't think Trump will not pick a vice president with any independent standing, right? Like Pence.
No.
Do you have a view on who, given his current mood and temper, what type of person he would take? I mean, would he firebrand, or would he just want someone who's totally loyal and won't cause any trouble and might help him in the election a little bit?
He's going to want somebody that looks good standing next to him. That'll probably be the first thing. And he won't talk much. And certainly won't take any independent positions, obviously. Thoroughly and totally loyal. But I think that how it looks on the sign will probably matter a lot too. How the name rolls. So I don't know. Kristi Noem has been campaigning for that job for a long time. Governor of South Dakota. Seems pretty unquestionably loyal. He probably likes how she looks next to him. There was talk of Tim Scott if he wanted to, continue Republicans making inroads among black voters. I don't think there's going to be a Tim Scott. I don't see any of the current field actually being in that. Sarah Huckabee Sanders. There you go. If you want to again make a play for that suburban woman vote, I don't know that she gets you that vote, but she is a woman. I don't know. Those would be some of the possibilities.
But loyalty, and no separate power base, obviously.
Yes. And Sarah Sanders owes her entire, political career to him. I mean, I know her father was obviously governor of Arkansas, but she was a very junior staffer in Republican communications when she got the deputy job at the Trump White House.
Yeah, or at least Stefanik, I guess, maybe, who also owes her career to switching sides, as it were, within the party and going with him. Right. Let me ask you one thing, though. I think one thing that's you've emphasized.
Trump Stefanik. Yeah, that might look good on a sticker. And she's in New York, but he's a Florida resident now, so you don't have the two-state issue. Yeah, that might work.
Yeah, well, it's happy to get.
He was the first to, she endorsed his 2024 campaign, issued the endorsement before he actually announced he was running again, which I thought was interesting. Yeah, I mean, almost nobody did. He had in the beginning, Republicans were. It was just after 2022. People were standing back, and she issued a full-throated endorsement the day before he announced he was running.
Let me ask you this: this doesn't exactly cut against what we've been saying, but I think it complements it. But I really want your judgment on this, as you're so close to it. I feel like it's been a pretty competent campaign by Trump. I mean, the proof's in the pudding or in the eating, right? I mean, he's doing fine. He beat back the kind of DeSantis challenge there in the early months of 2023, which wasn't, insubstantial. And DeSantis had won a massive reelection victory in Florida. It looked like it could be very serious. It seems like they're doing most of the mechanics pretty well. It's hard to tell at this stage at the end of 2023. Trump's Trump, so there's a lot of wackiness and craziness, but also a kind of purposefulness on the things he thinks matters. I mean, some people out in my world think it's terrible when he says people are vermin and has contempt for every part of the Justice Department and the rule of law and so forth. But he thinks none of that hurts him, and he may be right. And in fact, it motivates some of his voters. He thinks the thing that could hurt him would be looking too extreme on abortion rights And on that, he's been pretty disciplined in a way and walking away from, the most extreme, or I'll just say, or that's not fair to call it extreme, just the most pro-life position to a much more, muddied kind of, maybe leave it up to the state's position. So there's a kind of weird, both cunning politically and somewhat discipline almost by the campaign, competence by some of the campaign advisors in the mechanics that combines with all the, lawless plans for the second term. Am I exaggerating that, or is that true? Or talk a little bit about that. You talked to some of those campaign aides, I'm sure.
It's an interesting theory. I'll give you this. There's none of the drama of the infighting, which you had constantly in 2016 and 2020. I mean, the firing of campaign managers, the battles between Lewandowski and Manafort and Jared there's none of that kind of like drama where the people around him are throwing, are attacking each other and trying to, gain influence at the other's expense, which was not just the campaigns, but also the Trump White House. There really is none of that. But I think the reason why there's none of that is there's almost nobody working for him. I mean, there is no campaign. There's literally no campaign headquarters. So these folks are working virtually. There's a handful of people. There's, Chris LaCivita, who is new to Trump world. We remember him back from the Swift Vote Veterans for Truth campaign in 2004, the independent expenditure effort that turned Silver Star Vietnam war hero John Kerry into effectively a deserter or whatever they were. I mean, it was really quite a campaign, and that was
effective, right?
and he's a master of the dark arts, and he's effective, and he's an interesting guy, and I think that then he's there with Susie Wiles, who has experience as a Florida operative. At one point with DeSantis, till DeSantis fired her and then you got Jason Miller, who couldn't get a job in the Trump White House because of his some stuff going on in his personal life, but was a very effective communicator, probably the most effective communicator he had on that campaign. And then again in the 2020 campaign. So it's a small band. They don't fight with each other. They've done some things that have been very effective. I think LaCivita in particular has gone through and looked at the rules for selecting delegates in all the states. And they've tried to make as many states as possible winner take all, which they believe will be an advantage to Trump because he could win with 30 or 40% of the vote, all 100% of the delegates. So that's where I say yes, there is something that where this does look like a fairly effective campaign, but there is no campaign.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And he's not doing any campaign events. He does a rally here or a rally there, but he's doing almost no campaign events. Compare his schedule to the schedule of any of the others. He's not quite Biden, working out of the basement, but it's not far from that. He plays a hell of a lot of golf. And he spent more time in the month of October in a New York courtroom than he did in any form of campaigning. I think it was a total of 8 days on the civil case, not even on the criminal cases. He didn't have to be there, but he was. So I think that's helped him actually, because again, it means less focus on what he's actually campaigning about and what exactly a second Trump term would look like.
Yeah, it's like a weird version of a Rose Garden strategy, right?
Yes.
Right. People know he's got 99.9% name ID. The ones who were for him were all for him. He's got to not scare some of the other swing voters who got a little scared by 2020. And so maybe that's playing golf is not entirely.
No, playing golf is probably the best thing he can do. I outlined the first couple of months of the campaign, and I got a chapter called Dark Days at Mar-a-Lago about when he goes there and then he announces the campaign. And there was, I forget the numbers in the book, but it's something like 60 plus days where he did not leave a Trump property except to go to another Trump property to play golf. I mean, there's an upside to that. You know?
I am struck. I mean, so do you think it's sustainable? The number of normal-ish Republicans I run into who they don't like him much and they wish he didn't do A, B, or C. They haven't internalized at all what a Trump 2.0 would look like. And they're sort of reassured by a certain way he is able to be kind of normal in a Trumpy way, in a kind of, con man, Borscht Belt sort of shtick way, in a way, though, that reassures a certain type, I think, of Republican business voters. He doesn't look, if you don't go to the rallies look crazy, but when he's on CNN with Caitlin Collins, let's say, at that town hall, he looks a little, I mean, he's not a typical politician exactly, but he's not, I don't know. I was struck on people I ran into afterwards who thought he's okay. I mean, I wish he would kind of leave off of this thing a little bit or that thing a little bit. But at the end of the day, he didn't do anything that terrible in the first term, and he did some good policies. And why it'd be better than the Democrats? I don't know whether this is just good luck on his part or cunning or really thinking it through, but somehow he's able to balance, for now at least, the appeal to the base and the energizing of the base with a certain reassurance almost of, quote, normal Republican voters that it's not going to be not that much to worry about. Does he have a sense of that himself? Is that because he's a good demagogue and he himself was a kind of, when you covered him back in the 90s, just a totally normal, he's a Trump, but I mean, kind of his political views were just, whatever, a touch of nativism and racism, but basically generic, wealthy Republican, willing to be a Democrat when that was necessary type of voter, right? He sort of has a feel for those voters, I guess is what I'm saying, right? I mean,
he does, and he has a real feel for when he walks in the room. I mean, I think that's there have been stories about in the last few days about some of the big Republican bundlers who were like, we're never going to do that again, are now starting to say, well, I mean, he can go into a room, he makes you feel like you're the top of the world, and he's engaging. He'll tell some old stories, and it can be very easy to forget what he actually stands for, what he did, and what he's talking about doing.
No, I guess that's an important point. I think with the donors, I've been struck by the ones I'm still talking to a tiny bit, how much they like. He calls them up. They have access. He returns their calls.
Not like DeSantis. Remember DeSantis? Like nobody could get through to him, and he'd go there, and he didn't want to pose for pictures, didn't want to shake hands, go there, do what he has to do, collect the money, and get the hell out. Trump's much more charming and much more willing to engage those people.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point that's sort of missed by people who don't like me, who don't think he's dangerous. But, you hate to admit that he has a certain kind of political skill, really. And what about abortion? You've covered that a little bit. I mean, am I right that he's being that's the one where he's just decided that's trouble and I'm going to avoid it? And people make fun of him then. Well, how can you avoid it? Your judges overturned Roe v. Wade. Well, maybe, but you could
that's because we're going to do a deal. We're going to do the best deal ever. And this is going to make everybody happy because we the judges, everybody had been trying to overturn Roe v. Wade. Everybody. I mean, Democrats. I mean, everybody was. Hear him talking. He has no conception of the issue at all. It's not something he cares about at all. You remember when he was on with Chris Matthews in 2016, and Matthews said, "So what do you do if somebody abortion's illegal and do you punish the woman?" He's like, yeah, you punish the woman, right? Because it's illegal. I mean, he hasn't thought about it for a second. So he doesn't understand the issue. But what he understands now is that it's an issue that hurts Republicans. So he wants to, he's trying to do the version of, Richard Nixon's secret plan to end the war. It's like, I got a secret plan. We're going to negotiate this. Everybody's going to be happy. It's going to be the best. And that ambiguity, I think he has a sense that he can play up that ambiguity in a general election. Again, he's never strategic really about anything except for, a few things where he has a gut on. And his gut on abortion is hardline abortion positions going to kill the Republicans, going to make it impossible for him to get elected. But he can't alienate all those evangelicals that got him there in the first place. So he's navigating this. On paper, looks like a completely ridiculous position, but,
Yeah.
It may actually be the one thing where he's politically it's not nuts,
No, not at all. I think he says Roe v. Wade we overturned it to the evangelicals, to oversimplify, and he says to upper middle class businessmen and their wives, or businesswomen also. He says, states, that's an issue for the states. National ban can't, they tell me that can't get through. And so we'll work it out, and basically signals to voters in Michigan and Pennsylvania that if they have, as they do, Democratic governors and legislatures who are not going to pass an abortion ban, he's not going to do anything about it. You don't have to worry that. I mean, there's a limit to how far this goes, but as you say, it's a little, he's not going to, well, maybe he would explicitly say no national ban, but he needs to leave it a little murky, which could be a problem. But the degree to which I'm just struck on that one, that is, as you say, there are a few things that he seems to have thought about politically, and that seems to be one of them, where and he doesn't just go with the most radical instinct. He goes to this one with what's probably better for him politically.
Yeah, and the by the way, the ambiguity on abortion is exactly what Nikki Haley's doing, right? She's like, this, we're never going to have a national ban. By the way, and she sounds like so appealing to those fearful of a strident anti-abortion position. But then at the same point, yeah, I would sign a 6-week ban as governor of South Carolina. So she's got two very different messages. And, that's probably some variation of those two, of those positions is what Republicans will have to do on a national level to walk the line on abortion.
Yeah, it makes me wonder that if it does become sort of Haley kind of is the alternative to Trump, but Trump beats her presumably in the primaries, and so but she does better than everyone else. He'll be annoyed at her. He's calling her a bird brain. He, whatever. She hasn't been loyal. She should not have run against him since he appointed her to the UN and stuff. I still wonder whether he'll think to himself, you know what? If I make her VP, I probably win the presidency, and she's not really going to cause any trouble for me. So I wonder if people are. Or does he not have the self-discipline to say that, like Reagan and Bush, or he has to take someone who has never once even begun to criticize him? I wonder where.
No, I mean, look, first of all, he's shown the ability to embrace people that were totally against him. I mean, he actually kind of think sometimes in a way likes that.
Right.
It's like as long as you totally admit that you were wrong, then he's the greatest. And Haley has in the past shown an ability to do a remarkable set of changes on Trump, but I don't see it happening. I don't.
Probably Kristi Noem's the safer version of that, as it were. Final points. I mean, what have we not discussed that we should discuss for people to understand this kind of amazing moment we're in? I mean, we'll just go back those. You covered him in the White House. You covered January 6th so well. You covered him out of the White House. I guess I'm a little struck by that. People think he's still the same person he was in 2015. I mean, there's a certain, which reassures some people, but also allows other people just to mock him and make fun of him. He was a goofball then, and he's a goofball now, kind of thing. He didn't say a word about just how he's changed since you've dealt with him throughout those 8 years as well as before.
Yeah, I don't think he is the same guy. I mean, there are a lot of things that are the same, for sure. But I think that it's a much darker worldview, and I think it's not just that there are fewer restraints around him, although that is a big and important factor. But I think that he has been embittered by the loss and the legal travails. I think it really freaked him out to be in a courtroom the first time. I think he's gotten used to it now, but that first arraignment, even though it was on the most trivial of the cases, the Manhattan DA case, hush money payment case. I describe in some detail what it was like when he went in that courtroom, and it was the first time where he was not free to leave. I mean, he was under arrest. I mean, he wasn't literally in handcuffs, but he had to be there. When the judge walked in, he had to rise. The judge waited several minutes before walking in. He had to wait. And he said very little. He's full of bravado before and after. While he's there, I think it has really affected him. And then to go through it again with the federal cases, see those two indictments, go through the Georgia case, his mugshot. I think these have been searing experiences on him and have really crystallized this notion that he is that he wants to be president so he can eviscerate his enemies
and make sure he himself isn't punished for anything that he might have done, either in business or in government or in with classified documents. I mean, I hadn't really focused on that. I think that's an interesting point, though, right? That it means, doesn't it, that all bets are off in terms of recognizing the election results in 2024. I mean, 2020 could look like he doesn't control the federal government, so it's a little different, but the degree to which he will not simply roll, I guess I lost, I guess just all these court cases are just now going to go ahead. That doesn't seem to be his mindset, right?
Yeah. I mean, he certainly will never acknowledge a loss. I think that one question is what happens if Nikki Haley, she's probably the one best positioned, actually does pull off an upset victory here. I mean, he will destroy her. He's certainly not going to concede. And I think that's an interesting, I talked to Christie on this week on Sunday about this, like, cause Christie's, critical of Nikki Haley, obviously, for not being forceful enough in condemning Trump. But part of the calculation here is that whoever wins needs Trump's voters. You're probably not going to get them because he's going to be there, and I don't know if he runs on a third party or what he does if he loses. As I told Christie, it's probably a problem you'd like to have, but it's a very real thing. I mean, this is why, McCarthy embraced him, because he was concerned that, if he didn't have Trump on board, all those Trump voters wouldn't vote for Republican candidates in the midterms. Ronna McDaniel wanted to ensure he didn't leave the party because the party would lose all those Trump voters. That's still a real thing.
I think it is a real thing, and they're right to be scared he could run himself just to bring it all down. But in the general election point of view, the notion that if Trump's 8 points behind Biden, and really is 8 points behind, isn't just a little bit of a polling artifact, in, the beginning of October of 2024, and really is being told you're going to lose. The idea that he's going to just, okay, I guess I'm just like Bob Dole in 1996, I'll just go down, fighting hard and trying hard, but as a gentleman, so to speak. And I don't feel like that's where his head is either, right? I mean, God knows what kind of mob actions we would see and charges we would see and incitements to intimidation of election workers and race baiting. I mean, don't you think it could be a pretty... But
he doesn't control anything beyond the security personnel at Mar-a-Lago. So that is one critical difference. He doesn't, he can't try to,
right,
invoke the Insurrection Act.
No, he can't overturn. I think he has a much tougher time overturning it afterwards.
But
the
he can
incitement he could do with the public before is pretty scary.
Yeah.
Kind of a dark. Give us a slightly more upbeat note to end on. You end the book on a slightly upbeat note.
Yeah.
End this conversation on a slightly upbeat note.
I do. I mean, I think that I kind of end on a look at the Republicans who stood up and did the right thing after January 6th, after November of 2020. And there were, people that were some obvious names that we've talked about, like, Pence doing the right thing on January 6th, Liz Cheney standing up the way she did, Mitt Romney. But there were other names that people might not be as familiar with, and who didn't have a history that would suggest that they would stand up to the most powerful person in their party, who did and ultimately did the right thing. I mentioned all of those people in the Justice Department, other than Jeffrey Clark. Rusty Bowers, such an inspiring and good guy, as conservative as they come, the Speaker of the House, Republican Speaker of the House in Arizona, who was under enormous pressure. I mean, just mind-boggling pressure, and didn't buckle. So I think that there are good people. I point out to you, Bill, that in my book, which I really tried to write in a way that would appeal to Trump supporters, at least would take the time to listen and not be put off, to write for Republicans generally. I mean, 95% of the people that I spoke to for this book are Republicans, and many of them people that were very, very, very close to Donald Trump. Some still are. And, you know, I'm more hopeful because of that. And I'm also hopeful because for all the fears, the legitimate fears of the incitement of violence, I've also spent a lot of time over these last years traveling the country, going to a lot of Trump events. God knows I can't even count how many Trump events. And most of the people that go to his events and support him, they're not hell-bent on violence or overturning the government or any of that. I think there's a variety of reasons that they've supported him, but you know, you've got a lot of good people out there who believe that our system has failed them and failed the country, and have embraced Trump for that reason. But these are not bad people. I mean, some of them are, but some in any crowd are bad. You know.
Right.
But that's my optimistic note. I think that ultimately we do prevail. By we, I mean the Democratic Republic that is known as the United States of America.
That is a good note and a true note, I think, to end on. So, John Karl, thank you so much for joining me for this really interesting and thought-provoking discussion today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much.
And thank you all for joining us on Conversations.